Great, thank you so much, Jess, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to feel all these people in this room, not necessarily see you all, but it's great to see all this commotion in the chat and feel the warm energy here. So like Jess mentioned, I work for the San Mateo County's Office of Sustainability, and I'm just going to do a brief overview of what our office provides. This is our mission statement, which goes over that we are centered around building a sustainable community that fulfills the needs of the present and the future. That's our mission, and that's we're doing just a little piece of that here by trying to establish a community of edible home gardeners here with you all. This is an overview of our programs. We offer programs that are about home for all, which means that we're trying to advocate and create action plans to ensure that people in San Mateo County have opportunity for housing or active transportation that gets people out of their cars and into other ways of moving around the San Mateo County. Climate Ready SMC has a climate action plan. There's the Green Business Program that provides certification support for small to medium-sized businesses in our county. And then our energy-related energy and water programs involve the Bay Area Regional Energy Network that provides these really cool toolkits you can check out from the library to do an energy audit in your home and see where you're at, so that way you can start addressing those sustainability projects in your house, as well as Peninsula Clean Energy, which is a way for you to save money by switching to renewable energy. And our goal with Peninsula Clean Energy is to have a 100% greenhouse gas free electricity by 2021. And we can't get there without all of you participating, or at least just getting a little bit more interested in that. Finally, I think a program area that might be of most interest to many people on this call, if you are interested in kind of doing more waste reduction, expanding beyond the composting situation, we have our many waste reduction programs, including Sustainability Hotline. You can call and connect with us to get your questions answered. There's schools programs to make sure that every school has a facility they need to do appropriate waste reduction. We also offer a community garden and 4 R's grants. Those R's are reduce, reuse, recycle, and rot or compost. If any of these sound interesting to you, you are more than welcome to check out all the information we have available on our website, which is smcsustainability.org. So the Sustainability Academy is the program that is running this workshop. And this program is built to provide free education to raise awareness about complex socio-environmental issues, empower residents to take agency in their lives, and build community leadership through experiential education. This photo is showing what our Sustainability Academy workshops looked like before COVID, but we're still doing that now online. Great. And then this just gives a broad overview of the opportunities that are coming. If you are interested in getting more involved in Sustainability Academy, we have a Master in Local Sustainability as well as a Master Composter course that you can take. That's more than just a one-time workshop. That's something that you would attend once a week and get this certificate. So that way you have more information and the experience you need to really take more agency. We also offer different workshops, workshops around home composting, edible home gardening, like the one you're in now. And we have plans for the future to offer and expand these workshops to having local environmental justice panels, as well as furthering our ways that we can connect and engage our community with remote and distance volunteer opportunities. We can't do this without this wonderful team. Many of them are on this call right now. We have Ivana Andrade and Alejandra Warren up at the top with me, as well as other instructors. There's Joe Lees and Jess Coe. Jess is on this call. There's Eugene Fan, as well as, I'm blanking on his name. I need to get these all together. Jess, can you help me out here?
Todd.
Todd Sutton is teaching a composting workshop here in the bottom. Oh my goodness, there's so much pressure to know all the names at the same time. So this team is essential and has really shown tremendous resiliency. And so if you're interested in getting to know them, keep signing up for workshops like this. You'll get to recognize these faces. Jess is going to distribute a demographic survey for us here. And I just want to remind you all that the answers that you put into the survey are completely anonymous. Although it might not seem like it because you're logged into your account, we do not gather any of that data. And the data we do collect is helping us serve our community in a more appropriate and understanding way. So we really appreciate you taking the time to fill out this demographic survey. And we will not be using this information outside of just trying to serve this community better. Thank you for the tip, Sid. That's really great. This is so kind. Oh
I just launched the poll, so it should come up shortly, and there's always a decline to answer option for these questions. So if there's something you don't feel comfortable sharing, you can feel free to just select decline to answer, and you can also just click out of the survey if you don't want to participate at all. But we really do appreciate your participation. It helps us a lot to design the program appropriately.
Great, so we'll just give you a few moments now to fill this out.
Mm-hmm. As people are filling this out, I'll address something that came up in the Q&A, which is a question about recording. We are recording this workshop, and we will be sending it a link to view the recorded version out to everyone who registered. So thank you for asking that. Maybe just one more minute. I see a couple more responses filtering through. Got a good comment about the chat. We were only able to chat with panelists, I believe, but I just enabled chat so that everyone will be able to see your chat notes. And if you're having any issues submitting, sometimes you just need to scroll a bit further down to see the submit button. But if it's really not working, you can just click out of the survey. And yes, Felicia, I just saw your message in the chat, and your message that you just sent went out to all panelists and attendees, so everyone should have seen that. Right. We have about 75% participation, so I think I'm going to end the polling now.
Great.
So we can move on to the next section.
That sounds good. Thank you again for participating in that survey. It really does make our work just more poignant. All right, and then I just wanted to offer that if you have questions about any of the programs I mentioned or want to engage further with Sustainability Academy, you're more than welcome to visit our website, which is smcsustainability.org. Email sustainability@smc.gov if you have a specific question you'd like to get answered. And then this is the hotline phone number. All of this information is on our website, though. If you Google search us, you'll be able to find it. All right, great. With that, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker here, which is Jesus Jimenez. Jesus is an educator, aquarist, and facilities engineer at the Marine Science Institute. He has taught composting classes for Sustainability Academy, so some of you might recognize him. He also runs an urban aquaponic nonprofit organization to help bring fresh produce to underserved communities and food deserts. So I'm really excited to hear from him today. I'm always very engaged listening to the wonderful news that Jesus brings. So with that, Jesus, are you there?
Yes, thanks, Camille.
Of course.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for being here with us and bearing with our minor technical difficulties in the beginning. Yeah, it's a beautiful Saturday morning. We got a lot to kind of cover and go over and learn about. But before we get going, so if you could, next slide, please, Camille. I just want that little slide to be up there for a minute or probably less, but I just want to remind everybody in a couple of thoughts. If this is your first time joining one of our edible home gardening support groups, I want to share with all of you that this is a community-based learning group, and we greatly encourage the input and participation of everyone here who wants to, because I'm not an expert gardener by any means. And I don't ever want to be really, but I do enjoy gardening. I like making a lot of observations, and most importantly, I like sharing what I learn with folks. And I hope that I can learn from every one of you or anybody who has something to share. So just kind of want to remind everybody of that. We all collectively hold a great deal of knowledge, and I want to make sure everyone's clear that I'm not here to just sit here and teach and lecture. So this is a community learning space. And I hope that everyone can feel comfortable asking as many questions or giving any input and experience that might be relevant to what we're talking today. So definitely feel free to use that little chat box as much as you'd like. And then we'll talk very briefly about our Google group too at the end. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide. So again, really quick, here's our agenda just to kind of show everybody what we're going to be going over. Basically starting with indoor gardening, different crops that do well, outdoor gardening, and then moving mostly into outdoor after that. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with winter gardening indoors. Next slide, please. So, some considerations for anybody who is hoping to start or maybe thinking about gardening inside. First of all, just to kind of state the obvious, obviously plants indoors are a lot more protected from the cold outside and just the different impacts of the winter outdoors. So if you want to start gardening indoors, an easy way to do that is if you just have plants outside that are small enough to move in, you can just kind of bring them inside. There's a couple of things to remember, and the most important of those is the plants get enough light. So south-facing window is the best option for really any plant that you're going to be keeping indoors. The next best would be either east or west, but you want to stay away from north-facing windows because they're going to get very little or probably no direct light this time of year. So look for a nice south-facing window if you have one. That'll be the best bet for bringing any plants indoors, or if you're just starting to garden indoors from something you just bought or maybe planted some seeds. The other best option, the next best anyway, would be to have some artificial light. And there's lots of different options out there now that are pretty affordable. Just a quick kind of rule of thumb, you always want to, if you are using artificial light, keep about 4 inches or maybe like your palms or all your fingers anyway. Keep about that much space between the bottom of your light and the topmost part of your plant. So that might be something to consider. If you're planting something that you think might grow taller, you should always be able to keep the plant at least 4 inches away from the light to prevent any burning of your garden. A couple other things, if you're not using artificial light and you're just going off of the direct natural sunlight through a window, it's a good idea to turn your plant every so often so that a different part of the plant will be exposed to the light. Otherwise, you might get your plant start to kind of lean towards the window, which isn't a big deal for some slower growing plants, but if you're doing like herbs or leafy greens or anything like that, all your lettuce will kind of be planted to one side, and it's not ideal. You get better and more even growth if you just turn it every now and again. Small pots do great for indoors, especially if you're just starting off, about 4 inches as well, and that way they kind of like fit easily on windowsills. Or, you know, you could use clay pots, or you could just try repurposing any sort of plastic containers or larger cans. One quick thing to also keep in mind is, especially if you're bringing outdoor plants indoors, be careful with heat sources inside your house. Whether it's like if you're putting it in the kitchen and maybe you do a lot of cooking, or it's near your stove or oven, be careful of that. Or if it's near any kind of furnace, it might be nice and cozy for you inside, but if you're bringing something from outside in, that could be a shock. So just keep an eye on your plants if you're bringing them indoors for the first couple of days especially, and look for any sort of yellowing or wilting. So they might need to be adjusted. Okay, next slide. So some of the crops that do best indoors through the winter are, let's go ahead and, there we go. So just a couple of things before we go into these crops. Give me one moment, please. Herbs are definitely the easiest crops to grow inside. A lot of them can last all winter and only need, you know, a few hours of light a day to survive and still do well. The other cool thing is, if you have any of these herbs outside already, or if you know anywhere you can get them outside, a lot of these can actually be started just from like little cuttings. So you just start them in some water for a few days, and once you start to see roots forming, you can transplant them into a little tiny pot. Again, about 4 inches is really all you need for something to make it nicely through the winter. It's easy, it's cheap or free, and it's very low stakes, so just don't be afraid to try it out. Don't be afraid to experiment. And okay, yeah, let's go on to the next slide now. So mint is probably the easiest thing to grow, indoors or outdoors. As far as edible gardening goes, mint is a good starter. It requires the least amount of light of really any herb, which means if you really don't have a lot of natural light inside and you don't want to go and set up an artificial light, a grow light, then mint is a good option. And it's super easy to grow it from cuttings, so it doesn't take very much. And there's tons of varieties. So there's like peppermint and pineapple mint and chocolate mint and tons of different kinds of mints that you can choose from. And it's got tons of uses. You know, teas are really common, but even in salads, I love them in spring rolls. You know, maybe you can tell us your favorite mint dish down in the chat. But mint, it's a great starter. Does well pretty much all through the year and can survive the winter indoors or outdoors. Okay, next slide. All right, oregano. Also pretty easy to start from cuttings. If you know somebody or you have oregano outside and it's looking like it's starting to get kind of towards the end of its cycle before winter really sets in, it's a good idea. You can take some cuttings. It really helps if you're able to kind of like get down there into the soil and sort of divide or section off a little piece, so you bring it back indoors with some roots already. And this is a great method of just kind of like taking a plant that you have living already and thriving outside and taking a little part of it and bringing it indoors so it can survive through the winter, and then you can always transplant it back outside. So oregano is great. It's easy to dry and store tons of it to use later. It's rich in antioxidants and even has some medicinal properties. So oregano is probably also up there with mint as far as requiring less light than a lot of other herbs. Not as resistant though as mint. So next slide, please, Camille. Okay, rosemary. Rosemary is a little bit slower, but it can definitely be grown inside. Rosemary is going to take probably a week or two if you do start it from a cutting to actually start to put some roots out into the water, and then you can transplant into soil. But you could also always just kind of like buy a little starter, a little plant start of rosemary, and kind of like keep it nice and warm inside, and then let it grow as much as possible and transplant out into your garden in the spring. So obviously rosemary is super aromatic and very calming, can be used to infuse all kinds of stuff like oil, vinegar, and honey. And yeah, rosemary is slower growing though, so just keep that in mind. If you are hoping to use a lot of rosemary through the winter, maybe you can have more than one plant growing indoors. Okay, next slide. Now basil, I know we all love basil and use it a bunch, and it smells great and it tastes great, and you just eat it just like that. But it's not as easy to start from a cutting, especially in the winter. If you do want to do basil through the winter, I would recommend getting a start or even planting your own seeds, but that's going to take a little while. So if you want to start something or start using basil sooner, then I would recommend getting an already rooted plant and try keeping that near a sunny window inside. It does require more light than pretty much any other herb that we've gone over, so just keep that in mind as well. And it's also more sensitive to colder temperatures. So if your temperatures are down below like 60 degrees for days and days, then basil's not going to do too great. It'll survive, but it probably won't thrive. So just a bit more sensitive than the other herbs we've gone over, but it all depends on the conditions. Okay, next slide, please. So leafy greens. A lot of folks think that you can't grow leafy greens inside, and you definitely can. So this includes anything like lettuce and spinach and chard and pretty much any of those leafy vegetables that would go in a salad. And they can be grown successfully indoors through the winter, although it'll be slower than outside in the spring or summer. But again, here's where if you really want to have very productive salad greens through the winter, an indoor light, a grow light would be helpful. And there's lots of options out there to choose from. I wish we had more time to get into all the different details of how to choose an indoor light, but I think if anyone's really interested, you can spend 10-15 minutes and you're going to get a lot of different opinions. But generally speaking, we don't have to worry so much about like the spectrum of light and, cold versus or blue versus red and all these things, because leafy greens will thrive off of a pretty basic light because they're not actually going into a fruiting stage or anything like that. So just experiment. Even if you have something at home already, you don't have to go out and buy a grow light. Just try any kind of fluorescent light. I would definitely recommend fluorescent though, instead of incandescent, because it'll produce a lot less heat. Just remember, keep those 4 inches between your plant and the lights. And you only have to water every 2 or 3 days, and just as long as the top of your soil stays moist. And remember, if you are doing leafy greens, harvest only the outsides of your head or plant of whatever it is that you're growing. So if you're growing chard or lettuce, only harvest the outer leaves so that the inside can keep growing and producing more. And you want to fertilize when you first plant, and then probably about every month or so after that. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Camille. Okay, so this one I'm really excited about, but honestly don't know almost anything about. So growing sprouts indoors sounds really, really cool and promising, because it potentially is, not potentially, it actually is the fastest growing of any of the other edibles that we've talked about. because it's a matter of days. It's the fastest growing and could potentially give you the biggest yield because you could literally have it on a weekly schedule. So sprouts are pretty much the early stages of any germination of a plant, and usually just a few days old. Some of the common sprouts that are used are actually the common veggies like broccoli, different peas and beans, radish, beet, sunflower, alfalfa. All of those are really commonly used and eaten as these little sprouts, and they're super nutritious, sometimes more nutritious than the actual full-grown version of that veggie. So again, this is another one, like I said, I don't know anything about sprouts or growing sprouts, but it sounds really promising. I love sprouts, especially in a good sandwich. But if anybody has more input on sprouts, how to grow them, or any experience, please share with us in the chat, because we'd love to hear your advice. And it makes kind of a really cool experiment for the whole family or house. The other benefit is it doesn't really require very much light or any light, and it can be done in an enclosed space. So if you really are limited on window space or just space in general, it can be done in containers, like Tupperware containers or mason jars even, and it can just happen inside a cabinet. So it's really cool. It sounds really interesting. There's tons of information out there, and I would love to hear from anyone in the group who has grown sprouts before or is doing that now. Okay, next slide.
Question.
Oh, looks like Robin. Yes, Robin. No. I think I'll let you fill us in on any questions or comments in the chat, please, Jess. Thank you.
Okay. The first thing I'll just say is thank you for all of the participation in the chat. That is awesome, and that's why we're here. If you want to make sure that everyone in the group sees your message, just make sure that in the to sort of field, there's a little drop down, and make sure that you've selected all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see it. Otherwise, it's sometimes just coming to the panelists. So just make sure you're making that selection. But yeah, Robin is saying that they've sprouted some mung beans, which can then be made into a salad. It's not really growing because you're just sprouting them overnight, but after a soak. But I mean, growing in some way that's usable. There's a lot of great insight in the chat. And Jean and Terry, just to let you know, what you just sent to all panelists. So make sure that you're selecting all panelists and attendees where there's that drop down in the to field right above where you write your message. But let's get to some questions. So Terry asked, I'm getting blight on my greenhouse tomatoes. What do I need to do to rid my plants of this?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that last one?
Yes. Yeah. Terry said, I'm getting blight on my greenhouse tomatoes. What do I need to do to rid my plants of this?
Oh, that's a tough one. And I think it's hard to say without seeing an actual picture and kind of hearing a little bit more about the conditions or the situation in the greenhouse. I've had experience with it, but it's really hard to diagnose anything like that. So maybe a follow-up email would be good to better kind
or
of
the Google
advise
group.
on that.
The Google group is a good place if you want to post a picture of that. There's a lot of resources there, and I'll be sending out another link to join that Google group after this meeting, and I'll send it in the chat also.
Sounds like someone else has done lentil sprouts.
Yeah. So related to grow lights, you mentioned it a little bit. I think people are wondering if there's any kind of specific grow light that you've used that you would recommend, Jesus, or if it's really, I think you mentioned fluorescent light is your preference, but is there anything more specific that you'd recommend that you've seen work?
Yeah. So I spent a good bit of time looking into grow lights, the better part of a weekend, I want to say. And there's so much information out there telling you 2, or 3 or 4 completely different things, and everyone swears by it. And the truth is, until you actually try it, there is some research on, if you're growing a very specific garden, but until you actually try it and learn firsthand, it's hard to say exactly which is the best type of grow light. What I will mention though is that I would recommend either fluorescent, or even better would be like an LED, because they use less power and they produce even less heat. Yeah, and the other thing is, if we're growing, especially in the winter, chances are you're not growing anything that you want to produce fruit. So the light spectrum doesn't matter quite so much. There's a lot of options out there, but I would say try to keep it to fluorescent or LED, and remember just that spacing in between them. And then really anything will help your garden in the winter in these darker months.
Great, thank you. There's another question here from Pat, and they ask, related to cuttings, do you suggest putting them in water, or doing root tone on the ends, or putting them directly in the soil?
Yes, I personally if I'm going to start something from a cutting, will actually use just water, just a little shot glass or any kind of small container, and do the cutting. Just have it be no more than a couple inches even in the water. There's no need to fertilize or anything, because you just want the roots to actually start forming. If you happen to have a fish tank at home, a freshwater fish tank, that's a good little option. It makes it gives it that little sort of boost. Just take a little bit of the fish tank water and start your cuttings in there. But really, even with just tap water right out of your sink, it should work with at least the ones that I've mentioned now. Mm-hmm. You don't need to worry about fertilizing. And I personally haven't used any sort of coating for the cuttings, because I try to keep it pretty quick and fresh. So if I'm making a cutting, I go straight into water.
Okay, great. Maybe just one more question, then we can move on, or do you want to move on now?
I think we can see if there's time. There'll be a couple other slots for questions, right? Because we still got a good little bit to cover here.
Yes.
Okay. So moving into winter gardening outdoors. Go ahead and next slide, please, Camille. So some thoughts and considerations on gardening outdoors. First and foremost, just remember that what we're planting here this time of year, we're not going to be harvesting for a little while. Not until the early spring at the earliest, probably more like later in the spring. So just keep that in mind, unless you're doing, indoors. But if we're talking about outdoors, even if you plant today, things are going to need to just be established and get some real growth on them before it's recommended that you go and harvest. So patience, I guess, is all I'm really trying to say. And some other things are just, before you go and plant anything, and before you think about what you're going to be planting, know your area, know your garden's area, before you pick out plants or anything like that, and just think about how much sun this area where you're going to be growing your food gets. And, you can just kind of observe it all through one day, pop out wherever you're going to be growing and just keep an eye on it and see, okay, there was sunlight from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., or maybe it's a smaller window. think about whether it's exposed, really exposed to like strong winds or just frequent winds. Is it more of a foggy and damp area, or just your climate in general, or does it stay pretty dry? All those are things to consider before you even pick a crop. And then the couple of the things are obviously to keep an eye out for freezing temperatures, which means anything below 28 technically, but I would say, you know, even if you see anything in the forecast, like in the low 30s, you know, it's enough to kind of warrant going out and taking some measures if you have anything that's especially sensitive. So we'll go over a little bit about what crops are hardier, and then how to protect some crops that are more sensitive, or that you just want to have a better opportunity at growing faster. So yes, and then next slide, please, Camille. Perfect. So I always recommend that we all take, go back to that plan. We all take the time in the winter to plan out your whole garden for the whole next year, and look at planting calendars. They're super, super useful. I didn't use planting calendars for a long time, and it was just kind of like, and it really makes a difference between just harvesting here and there, and planting here and there, and just sort of like moving with your garden, as opposed to constantly being able to harvest all through the year. So if you take the time now to look at a planting calendar and make a planting schedule, it'll really pay off come spring and pretty much come the rest of the year. So plan, and look up a Bay Area planting calendar to kind of give you a guideline as to what to start planting and sowing when, so you can have something to eat all year long. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to talk briefly about some recommended crops for outdoors in the winter. Let's see. So these would be ideal if planted in either January or February, although they can be planted later. They could be planted as early as January or February. But again, this is all dependent on your specific garden, your space, and the conditions of your garden. So that's step number one, is kind of like you have to assess your own garden and determine how much sun it gets, most importantly. So I don't recommend that you plant or sow seeds outdoors this time of year, just because they have such a hard time with the cold nights to germinate and kind of grow. So if you are going to plant in the next month or two, I would recommend either planting and starting your seeds indoors and then transplanting outdoors, or you can just buy little 6-packs or little veggie starts, because it's just too cold outside right now for sowing in the ground. Most places anyway. You might live in a really cool spot where you get still, 6 or more hours of sun and the soil stays warm and you have it already protected, in which case you probably know and have already tried and learned that you can actually plant or sow seeds outside. But for the most part, I recommend against sowing seeds outdoors this time of year. And yeah, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So back to the leafy greens. Lettuce is a great and easy crop to do outside this time of year. Again, this is, if you plant in the next month or two, it'll do well and you'll be harvesting in the early spring. There's tons of varieties out there to choose from. If you don't know which one to choose, or you don't have much experience, I recommend looking at the little packet of seeds if you are doing it from seeds, or maybe looking up the different varieties and picking one that's cold tolerant, or more cold tolerant anyway. And one other thing you can do is you can just try planting a variety if you're doing it outdoors, and then just see which one does better. So again, planting in January means you'll probably be harvesting by like early March. You could technically start harvesting before then. It'll just be like sort of, you know, like a baby salad, and go easy on them. Okay, next slide, please. So carrots are probably some of the most cold tolerant crops. And believe it or not, I just learned this the other day, some colder nights actually make carrots sweeter. So you want to plant them. The thing about carrots and most root crops is they need at least 12 inches of soil. So it's not recommended to be planted very, you know, in shallow planters or little pots or anything like that. So always keep that in mind. And the softer soil is generally better for rooting crops as well. If you plant carrots in the winter, you'll probably be harvesting sometime around April and then through the summer. But obviously with carrots and roots and really any kind of crop, if you're planting in the ground, beware of gophers. Even if it's in a raised bed, you know, it always helps to have that mesh underneath. So next slide, please. Okay, bulb onions, also super hardy. These are the smaller onions, not big old yellow or red onions. And they have that more kind of milder flavor. They also need at least 12 inches of soil, and softer soil is better. And you can harvest about 2 to 3 months after you plant. But with onions, these little bulb onions, and also carrots really, and any kind of rooting crop, you want to be patient when you do start to harvest, and don't just like clear everything out. If you harvest too early, they're less likely to multiply and to keep producing more bulbs. So patience definitely pays off with bulb onions. It's a little bit different than, like, for example, leafy greens or the lettuce that we were talking about, where you can just cut and come again and keep harvesting, and they'll just keep producing more from the center out. With onions, if you harvest too much at once, they might not multiply. Okay, next slide, please. All right, chard, one of the most beautiful crops out there, and bountiful and flavorful, is also one of the most cold tolerant. So in the picture here we have rainbow chard, and there's so many different ways of cooking it or just having it in a salad. If you plant now or in the next month or so, you can start harvesting in late March or April. And again, just like I was saying, the cut and come again method, you want to just harvest the outer leaves and let the inside grow, and harvest the outside and let the inside grow out. And the cool thing about chard is that it can last you, like if you plant 6 heads of chard or kale, it can last you and keep producing all through the year and well into next year. So very, very hardy plants. Once they're well established, that can keep producing lots and lots of nutritious greens for you. Okay, next slide. So radishes, not really my favorite, but they are very cold tolerant, and they're pretty easy to grow. Just like with carrots, though, they need at least 12 inches of soil, and radishes will need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight is recommended. So just keep that in mind. That's why it's important to kind of like observe and check out your garden and the conditions before you pick a crop. So you don't want to get radishes if you're going to end up only, you know, having a couple hours of direct sunlight through the winter. Doesn't mean they're going to die, but they're just not going to grow very, very quickly. Okay, next slide. All right, and I know we're going through this kind of quickly, but yes, time for some questions or input.
Yeah, so a question that has been brought up a couple times related to light. Could you kind of define what you mean by direct versus indirect light? And with indirect light, how do you kind of achieve that if it's not there naturally in your garden?
This is outdoors, right? Yes. So direct light would be like the sunlight that's hitting me now. There's no filter, no shade or anything in between the sun and me. And indirect light would just mean that perhaps if you're under like some thick overgrowth, or you have a tree, maybe the tree's not covered in leaves, but there's still a lot of branches through the winter, and that sort of blocks off, not all the light, but it's patchy. So it sort of filters out some of the light, and ultimately what happens is your garden and your veggies don't get as much light. So that's the difference between direct and indirect light. There's not much you can do as far as like outdoors. We're going to get into the different kind of methods of gardening outdoors, but if you're planting in the soil and you have some block, whether it's a tree or an overhang or anything like that, you can always trim a tree, if that's worth it for you and your garden, or you can plant something in containers so they're a bit more mobile. So those are just kind of the two options as far as like how you get around your garden not having enough light in the winter outside.
Great, thank you. This is a bit specific, but could be worth bringing up about slug prevention. Someone asked, does diatomaceous earth stop slugs?
I believe it does. I've never actually had to deal with slugs, knock on wood, but I think diatomaceous earth does work against slugs as well, because it's essentially, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. I'm curious if anybody else has dealt with slugs and knows whether diatomaceous earth works. Maybe if you could respond in the chat, that would be awesome.
Cool.
Okay.
All right.
So, should we move on, Camille? Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Hey there, Camille. Should we go into slide outdoor gardening methods?
Maybe she stepped away for a moment.
Okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and start talking, because I saw it in a couple of the chat comments already. Thank you. We're going to, if you could hop one more slide over, please. There we go. So we're going to talk about the different methods of planting outdoors, because there was already kind of some conversation happening about this, and I know there was some comments in the chat about raised beds and ground. And so the three methods that we're going to briefly touch on are for outdoors are the difference between planting in the ground versus planting in containers versus planting in raised beds. And they all have their pros and cons, like everything in life. So we're just going to touch on it briefly here, starting with planting directly in the ground. So some of the benefits of planting in the ground are, to start, it's the most cost effective, right? It's super cheap. The soil is already there. You might need to amend it a little bit, but it doesn't take any real serious materials or infrastructure or anything like that to grow some veggies. It's just a little bit more work. So it's easier to grow larger amounts of food, because, if you have the space for it, then it would be to have enough containers to grow the same amount of food. Some other pros are there's a lot more beneficial microbes and biodiversity and just biology, a lot more activity, which, if you plant directly in the soil, because everything's there, which means healthier plants, right? There's more things breaking down nutrients that your plants can eat up. But it's a double-edged sword, because when you're down on the ground, you're also if you're a veggie. You're down on the ground, you're also more exposed to all these different pests. So it's good and bad. And you have a bit more freedom to kind of, figure out exactly how much space you're gonna want for roots versus greens versus tomatoes, if you have the space. So some cons are, like I mentioned, there's usually a lot more weeds and pests to deal with, which is not to scare anybody away, but it's just something to take into consideration. If you just want a garden that's low maintenance, they just go and harvest, and you're not going to be needing to make, a salad for 10 people every week, then you can probably just, do with some smaller containers. It is a bit more physical labor, and obviously, if you don't have the space, then it's kind of impossible for you. Some other things are like we were just talking about. If the only space you have to garden in the ground is in a shaded area, then it's not going to be a very productive garden. You can find, like more shade tolerant crops, but you're limited by the space you have available. And then with that also, if any one of your crops is not doing so great in that area, it's not as easy to just pick it up and move somewhere else. So those are just some thoughts if you are considering planting in the soil. But again, I'm not trying to scare anybody away. I know there's a lot of, things to keep in mind. That, obviously planting in the soil works. It's been working since forever. And you can definitely get some real beautiful, bountiful garden and food from planting in the soil. So one last thing is you don't really get to pick your soil or the makeup of your soil. So you might need to adjust it and amend it a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. So planting in containers. It's kind of the opposite of in the soil. So some pros are that you can obviously garden just about anywhere you can fit your container, whether it's a pot or a bucket or anything cool and repurposed. You have total control of the soil, right? So you can either go out and buy potting soil, or you can take some soil and sort of like just amend it a little bit, and depending on what you're starting with, and you can move them to whatever ideal location is best suited for your crops. There's also generally fewer pests to deal with, just because they're up above, down on ground level, and not everything can make it up there. And yeah, you can garden just about in any kind of setting. And one other quick thing to keep in mind too, especially in the winter, is that if you are gardening in containers, I think like in the picture here, you can see that's all on a sort of sidewalk or pavement. If that gets plenty of sun, that cement will actually hold quite a bit of heat that it gets all day, and kind of just hold it there, and might help to keep your pots and your soil and your roots a little bit warmer. So some things to look out for though. Obviously, you don't get as big of crops as you could in the ground, just because there's less space for your roots and your plant to grow. Soil dries up faster in containers. And then especially if you're using clay pots. Clay actually, because it's somewhat permeable, it will lose a lot of moisture that way. So it's not to say that it's not good, it just means you have to keep that in mind and probably water more often. And then the last thing is soil can actually get expensive. If you're trying to set up or have like tons of containers, it can get kind of pricey to buy all that soil. So, and then of course, when you're planting in containers, you don't have as much of that microbe activity that's keeping your soil nice and healthy. So I usually recommend, if you are doing in containers, I'd like to always add at least a few handfuls of some healthy live, either soil or compost to introduce those microbes to your containers. So, and get creative. You can plant in just about anything. Oh, one last thought with planting in containers that specifically relates to winter is you got to watch out if you do have containers outdoors and you have a plant saucer or any sort of little water catch down at the bottom. Be careful of that, especially during the rain. Because if it rains, you might not be worried so much about your plants because they're getting watered by the rain, but all that water is ending up trapped down there, and you could get root rot. So just keep that in mind. If it rains, for several days, or we get a lot of rain coming through, and you have those plant saucers, maybe go and check on your plants. Make sure that you dump that out and let the soil also drain out. Otherwise, it'll be all swampy and saturated. Okay, next slide. So planting in raised beds is the last method that we're going to go over here. And it's kind of the in-between, right, of planting in containers versus planting in the ground. There's definitely more control of your soil because you're anywhere from 12 to 16 inches above the rest of the ground. You're still technically on the ground, but there's more control of the soil, which also means you probably have to buy more soil. And it's generally easier to manage pests than growing on the ground, and you can grow a wide variety of crops in raised beds. So plus they're more ergonomic. So depending on how it's designed anyway, you don't have to lean over or bend over way down to the ground. So a little bit easier to work. And we're going to talk about this in just a little bit, but when you have raised beds, it's pretty easy to build a small structure around them, either like a hoop house or a cold frame, to protect them during the winter. And keep your things, very, very live and productive, even during the cold months. So some cons, again, it's expensive, both just to fill with the soil, but obviously to build. Unless you have these materials on hand or you like repurposing stuff, I've seen tons of folks make planters out of like pallets. You take all the wood from pallets and you can make planters out of them. Might be a little bit limited in your size options, but it definitely works. You have to kind of amend and add soil regularly. And then obviously it requires a certain set of skills and tools to be able to build it. It's not too complicated, but it does require at the very least, like a saw and hammer and nails and maybe, a drill, or just depends on how much you want to get into it. So one other thing is that raised beds can actually dry up faster than in the ground because they're elevated, and most folks we don't use like a liner or any sort of membrane between the wood and the soil, so that even just that aeration being exposed to up above the ground will actually dry out the soil faster than down in the ground. And it's not such a big deal in the winter because things aren't as hot and things tend to stay more wet and damp, but it could backfire during hotter weather. So you might find out you're actually watering a lot more than you used to if you were, for example, growing in the ground and then did raised beds, exact same spot. You're going to be watering more in the summer during the really hot days because the soil can dry up a lot faster. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're going to move on to a couple of other topics that we're going to touch on briefly and talk quickly about compost use and how late fall into winter is a great time. Right now is a great time to really start thinking about composting and gathering all the amazing material and gold that's out there in your yard and in the street. And then also talk about pests Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. So I know I saw a couple of comments or chats about how to prepare soil for planter boxes, and there's all these different ways of doing it. But, you know, for anyone who hasn't done composting or maybe, you know, thought about it too much, it's really just an important, really important thing to kind of connect when it comes to gardening. So if you love gardening and growing your own food, then at some point or another, you really have to start thinking about composting. So again, now is a great time to prepare your soil, because there's all these leaves and dead plant matter that happens in the winter, in the fall and winter. So, you know, you can collect all that and just let it do its thing, let it break down. And then in the spring, you'll have tons, depending on how much, you know, you're willing to work for it. But like if you know, were to put together something like what you see in the picture there, you'd have plenty of, it's not just soil either, it's really rich compost. So you can just add a little bit of this to some pretty basic soil, and you'd have a great way to start off planting in the spring. So just a quick mention here for the upcoming compost workshop on Saturday, January 23rd. I highly recommend this for anyone who either has never done composting, who has tried it before and just a little bit rusty and want to get back into it. It's an awesome workshop. It's obviously free, but then you get all the materials, or you qualify to get all the materials you need to start composting at home. So you can either choose from a worm bin or a hot compost bin, both of which are great experience, I think, for the whole family, really. And again, it's just a really important sort of thing to connect is composting, because we all think about, you know, all the plants need are you know, light and water in the soil, but there's so much more. You know, we're not really feeding the plants, we're feeding the soil. So composting is very important. And yeah, I would recommend that everyone at least check out the a bit more details on that workshop on Saturday. And I believe it will also be bilingual. Okay, so next slide. All right, I know there's always a lot of questions about pest repellents. And similar to lights, there's a lot of different options out there, but the good thing is with repellents, there is a couple of sort of basic recipes. So we're going to go over one of them here today. Really, all you need is a quart of water, a teaspoon of biodegradable soap and liquid soap, and then a teaspoon of any kind of oil, right? Well, either cooking oil or neem oil are the most recommended. Personally, neem oil is quite a bit more effective, but cooking oil works if you just want to start experimenting and trying it out now. And all you really need to do, or you take those three ingredients and you pour them into something like this, and you mix it up really, really well until it's nice and distributed. Super basic recipe, but it works. So you want to make sure, though, that the soap you use is biodegradable, because if you think about everything you're spraying, you're at some point or another going to use or consume. But then also think about the impact in your soil and the environment in general. So we want to reduce those negative impacts and stay away from non-natural pesticides. So the ingredients we're talking about here are obviously all natural, and they're all pretty much like food grade quality. So neem oil, I know I mentioned it a second ago, and you hear about it a lot for pest repellents, and it's because it works on more than just a physical way. Like what oil and soap generally, what it does to little bugs and pests is it suffocates them by clogging their pores, so they can't respire. So neem oil works on that level, but it also has some other properties. So it's a hormone disruptor, and it'll affect insects at all different life stages, like an egg, a larva, or adult. So it does more than just physically, kill the bugs. And then it has some fungicidal properties as well. So there's tons of other ingredients. But just a couple of notes on some other ways that you can experiment. Baking soda is really effective. So mixing a teaspoon of baking soda to this base recipe here is really good for any sort of fungal disease. So if you have powdery mildew or you positively identify anything in your garden as something fungal, then adding a little bit of baking soda to this recipe will make it that much more effective for fungal disease. One recipe that I used for a long time, and I swear by it, was actually the three things you see up here: the oil, water, and soap. And then I would also use garlic and onion. And what I would do is blend a whole bulb of garlic, not just a little clove, but the whole bulb. Just blend it in some water with an onion and let it steep in about a quart of water overnight. And then you strain that through a cheesecloth or whatever you have. Make sure it's a fine strain though, because you don't want your bottle getting clogged. So you blend that, and then you add that to this recipe, or you add the other ingredients to complete this recipe. And I found that to be super effective. And the one thing though is that you want to store that in the fridge, and it'll last you 2 or 3 weeks. Chili powder or cayenne also I hear about, and a lot of folks recommend, and it's effective more as a deterrent than a pesticide. So it won't kill a lot of bugs, but they don't like the taste or smell of it, so they stay away. And then I've heard that, like, if you're having problems with larger pests, rodents or squirrels or whatnot, or even raccoons, look into increasing the concentration of your chili powder, because they're a lot more sensitive to that. So those are just some quick tips. Next slide, please. Now, as far as using the repellent, oh no, I'm sorry, this is still how to mix it. So I showed you how you just kind of mix it. Here we go. Next slide, please. So some really quick tips. Before you start using your spray on any plant, you want to do it on a small area, maybe just one leaf, one little corner, and it's kind of like, you're testing it to make sure that your plant doesn't respond negatively to it, or it's not sensitive to it for whatever reason. So it's kind of like asking the plant for permission to use this foreign substance to it. So always test on a small part. And once you confirm, okay, yes, this plant is fine after a couple of days and there's no negative side effects, which there generally isn't with this basic recipe that we've used, you want to make sure to be diligent with your spraying. So you spray the top and the bottom of leaves, especially if it's kind of gone out of hand. If it's a bad infestation, you want to do it like check them every day. Spray as many of the surfaces as you can, and the spray can be used both indoors and outdoors. And just remember too that no one spray, no matter how good the recipe, no matter how many people swear by it, there's no such thing as just the one spray solution that's going to take care of your pest problem. It's really a lot of a multifaceted sort of thing. So there's a lot of other things you can do, like actually removing the pest physically, or removing leaves that are really badly infected, or even the whole plant if it's just gotten out of hand, because it's worth sacrificing this one really badly infected plant to keep the rest of your garden healthy. You can also plant sacrificial crops, that pests might like more than the things that you're eating. And there's a lot of options for that too. So then all the pests or slugs or whatever you have going on will migrate and go to that one crop that they prefer, and then you remove them off of that. So it kind of helps concentrate them. And then just in general, planting pest-resistant crops. And all those different actions combined are what's known as the integrated pest management. And that's definitely worth looking into. Integrated pest management, or IPM. If anyone is struggling with pest problems, I highly recommend you just like spending a little bit of time looking into that. Okay. And yeah, just don't forget to share. If you come up with your own recipe or you find something that works for you, please share it with us. Because I know there's a lot of different options out there. Okay, so here we are.
Here we are. Lots of chat going on. Thank you all again for that. So one person mentioned that they have a lot of wind in their garden. It gets full sun, but very, very windy, and leafy veggies just die. Do you have any suggestions for wind-tolerant veggies?
Wind-tolerant veggies in the winter, if you're just starting, might be kind of hard. Because if you are just starting to sow or plant, then just about anything you plant is going to be pretty small and fragile. So I guess it would depend. If you're just planting right now, I would say the best thing would be to set up some sort of protection or barrier, if that is an option. Or plant something else that's already bigger and it's just sort of a natural barrier. But those would be my two kind of first actions on trying to do that. I personally don't know of anything that would withstand like gale force winds, but if I don't know, I'm curious if anybody else out there might have an input.
Rakesh mentioned, yeah, if possible, try to funnel the wind to another part of your garden. He added a gate to his property, and that helped. Yeah.
Made a big difference. Yeah.
Okay. Let that continue to play out in the chat. Jenny asked about fabric pots and whether fabric pots are actually better than plastic pots for planting.
Fabric pots are really cool. They are better because they drain really nicely and they keep plenty of oxygen within the soil, so it's a nice loose soil. The problem is also that they'll dry up very quickly, so that's just something to keep in mind with fabric pots. They work really well, and generally, like if you're thinking about transplanting something later, fabric pot's really nice because it's easy to soften up, and then you can remove your plant and go and plant it in the ground or in a bigger pot or anything. But just keep in mind that because it's fabric, it'll just dry up pretty quick. So it might help to have just check on it more regularly and make sure that you're watering enough.
Great. I know we should move on, but I'll just ask, these are kind of related around pests. Jill asked about a few examples of pest-resistant plants. And then Andrea, along the same vein, asked about any recommendations for sacrificial crops, like what do aphids like, what do slugs go for, so you can kind of draw them away.
Yeah, I have never used sacrificial crops. I'm wanting to, but most of my gardening has been either semi-indoors or protected or up on like a balcony. So I don't know. I'm not familiar with sacrificial crops or which ones out there, you would want to get for aphids versus snails versus, but I know that a quick search would probably bring up plenty of information. I do know that they work though. They work really well. And sometimes it's not even another vegetable, but maybe a certain type of flower that that the pests prefer. So it might actually bring in a little bit of color and diversity to the garden. But as far as which ones are best for which type of pest, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One last question that's come through a couple times from Araceli is something that you're going to be addressing next. So I think it's a good question to transition about how to protect strawberries from frost.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll that's
perfect
you can
timing.
kind of transition because you're going to be showing.
Yes, we are actually, thank you, Araceli. Thank you for that question, because we're pretty much ready to move into the next slide and the next section of our presentation. So we're going to talk about how to do exactly that, how to protect outdoor plants during the winter. And this, we're going to have to actually virtually move over there. So bear with a little bit of the motion. But
Camille, you could
stop
go over sharing if you'd like so that everyone can see. Here we go.
Oh, cool. Okay, cool. So, yeah, let's go ahead and I'm going to show you as I talk to you. Hope everybody can see and hear. And if you, if it's hard to see or hear or anything, maybe you can just let me know, Jess, and we'll try to adjust over here with the whole camera crew and everybody. Okay? We good?
Cool.
Okay, hang on one second. I think what I'm going to do is go like that. Okay. So, how's the lighting?
Good.
Okay.
It looks good.
Can you see me? Yeah, okay, great.
So
we have some raised beds out here, and they're all pretty much been cleaned out except for that one where it's almost all mint. But we're looking to start planting here pretty soon. So what we're going to go over is how to build a simple but very effective little hoop house, just like this one. And there's a bunch of different ways to go about it. So it really, if you're creative or like to kind of experiment, this is an awesome project that'll allow you to grow food through the winter. So this is just, I love using recycled, repurposed material. So I happen to have that piece of plastic around. Didn't have to go out and buy any. But if you don't have a big piece of plastic like that around, you can find something at like a hardware store, Home Depot, or whatever might be near you. It doesn't matter so much how thick or what quality it is. Just keep in mind that you get what you pay for. So generally, if you get, just what's known as poly sheeting or plastic sheeting from Home Depot or anywhere, if it's really super, super thin, like tissue paper thin, it's probably not going to last very long. And maybe a strong wind, even if it's secured, a strong wind might punch a hole in it. So just keep that in mind. There's all these different grades from 1 mil up to like 6 mil, and that refers to millimeters thick. So, yeah, plastic sheeting. If you don't have that, one other option too, if you're just trying to protect from frost, you can get creative with like trash bags or anything. And then also just keep in mind, don't use a black trash bag because then it's going to be pretty dark in there. But yeah, so the idea is to just have a sort of blanket. Okay, so what we have is a 3 by 6 foot bed, and we built these little hoops out of 1/2 inch PVC, which is this right here. So this is just PVC, and you can get this also from the hardware store. They usually come in like 8-foot pieces, and it's pretty affordable. I know it's not pretty. It's kind of industrial looking, but you can actually paint it. So you can paint it to whatever color you want to be, you know, a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Again, I actually used some old half-inch PVC that I had laying around. I would recommend, especially if this is your first time working with PVC or anything like this, that you buy new stuff. And the only reason why is because if you have old PVC laying around and it's been out in the sun for like years, then it might snap when you try to bend it like this. So luckily here we were able to do it, and everything seems to be just fine. Yeah, let me show you kind of how these go together. So if we want to come a little closer, what we did was cut. So again, this is a 3 by 6. So for 3 feet, we used a 6-foot piece of PVC. And there's not much to it. You want to start off, this is again, if you already have a raised bed built. So you start off on one corner, and then you just slowly and carefully bend the other corner or the other end of your pipe down so it's secured like that. Now, know what you're thinking. Obviously, that's not gonna stay in there very long. So we have all these different ways of securing it. Well, not so many. There's 3 different ways, or maybe 4. We'll see what we can come up with. But probably the easiest way that requires the fewest amount of tools, although it does require buying more material or more things, are to use these things called pipe clamps or pipe straps. You can also find them at any hardware store. So this is like 1/2 inch. These are actually called conduit clamps, but they look like this. So that's exactly what it looks like. And these, you come over here, this one's plastic, PVC, and these, you know, don't do so great in the sun. So if you are going to use plastic, they work fine, but you definitely want to paint them or make sure that they're below the soil so that they're not going to be exposed to UV. The other option is to get metal ones. This one is also for 1/2 inch. This one's stainless, but at the hardware store you can usually find either plastic or galvanized metal. So either of those two work, and they're pretty cheap. So again, super easy. One thing I forgot to mention as far as cutting the PVC, when you're talking about 1/2 inch PVC, you really just need any kind of little saw. You know, if you have like an old bread knife even that you're ready to just part ways with and give it up to the garden. PVC, when it's that small, 1/2 inch, it doesn't take much to cut just a few pieces. So cut your PVC, and then if we can get down into the bed here, this is all there is to it. So you take your pipe clamp and you screw into your raised bed. And you want to make sure you get at least 2, one down below and one up above. And then also make sure when you use your screws, make sure your screws are not so long that they're going to pop out of the wood and potentially scratch or cut somebody out here. So these screws are just the right size. You want to make sure that your screw bites into the wood or screws into the wood at least 1/2 inch. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you don't want to go out and buy more stuff, which I fully support, what you can do is you come on over here and check out this other example. So this works as well. So I just pre-drilled. That's the thing, is you'll need a bit more tools. Give me 1 second. So these, again, just 2 screws, 1 and 2, but you do need to use a pre-drill to make it through both the PVCs, or both sections at the top and bottom, and then you put a screw through the whole thing. So these 2 corners are done and using that method, It means you don't have to go out and buy those little pipe clamps. And if you just have some screws laying around, you could just make that work. Same thing though, when you're using any material out in the garden and you want things to last, definitely think about what kind of screws you're using. So you don't want to use just like sheetrock screws or anything like that, because they'll rust pretty quick and they won't last long, and then you might have a little disaster in the spring or summer. So use something like deck screws or any sort of outdoor grade screws that are more weatherproof. I don't recommend using nails for these kind of little projects, because you're going into pretty thin wood, and just, if you can imagine, kind of hammering away here, it might do more damage to your raised bed than it's worth it. But that same screw method would work here just the same. I would just punch a hole, and then you screw in a couple of screws. Okay, so what if you don't have a raised bed? There's one more option. If you want to use, well, let's finish this one first, actually. So you got your little hoop set up. Then what you end up doing is you just kind of take plastic, and for this hoop house that, again, is 6 foot by 3 foot, I cut out a plastic that, oh, actually, I think I have it the wrong way. Okay, so it doesn't have to be super airtight. I mean, you can get creative and you go crazy and make it as airtight and snug as you want. I'm sure your plants will really appreciate it. But the main concern is to keep the frost, right? Like somebody had just mentioned, to keep the frost from settling down on your garden. So you get it more or less set up. Now you see this one's a little bit lower, so we'd have to bring that up a little bit, but it's okay because that one's not screwed in. And then you use these guys. These are called spring clamps. And again, they're pretty cheap. You can find them at just about any hardware store or the dollar store. I really like these metal ones because they last forever, even if they get rusty. You don't need it to be this big. I think this is a 6-inch one. Really just these little 2-inch ones, that'll work. These little plastic ones will work, but not as good and not as long. And I try to stay away from plastic anywhere, any way that I can. So spring clamps, what you want to do is we're pretty much going to go around and clamping this, right? But there's one step that'll make a big difference, and that is to take some hose. So these are just little pieces of garden hose, an old garden hose that we have laying around, and you just kind of like very carefully snip right through them. So what this does, little piece of garden hose, is that it makes a nice little bumper. It protects the plastic from your spring clamp. So you get your garden hose on there, and then you get your spring clamp on. That's it. That's all there is to it. And then you kind of want to set these up at the very least in the corners, and you can sort of adjust. Garden hose, spring clamp. And you can get creative with how you want to sort of clamp the sides. And you go around as many spring clamps as you want. Really, I would say you want to have at least the 4 corners and maybe the 2 tops. So I guess a total of 6 of these clamps, and that'll be pretty effective. Another way of doing it is if you have all this excess plastic, you can just put a board down here. So just go like that, and that'll work for the most part. If you know you got a lot of wind in your garden, maybe use 2 boards, or maybe bury that little piece of plastic a little bit. So What if you want to constantly be checking on your babies and popping this open all the time? Well, then you probably don't want to use a board. I would say you can just keep the spring clamps. One thing I've seen and is really cool is you can take something like this pipe and just use a little bit of tape. You can use a little bit of tape, or you can use a couple of these. This is really fancy though. You don't actually have to go out and use these, but they work really well, I will say. And these are snap clamps, and these are for 1/2-inch PVC. Everything we're using is 1/2-inch, and the way they work is they just kind of, so put that there, roll that up, and they just snap right on, and that's not going anywhere, right? So you could use these up here too, and they're super common. That's actually one of the main things that these are used for, is building hoop houses or greenhouses or whatever out of PVC. But the cool thing about these snap clamps is that you can kind of go like that. So you can still get into your little hoop house. If you know it's going to be a nice sunny day and you want them to get direct light, you can do that. And then at the end of the day, don't forget, you cover them up, keep them nice and warm. So that's the basics of the structure. So a couple of options. If you don't have a raised bed, what you can do, and again, this takes a little bit of woodworking, but it's really not that bad, is you can build a frame. Now this is literally just 4 pieces of scrap wood, just screwed in at each corner. And again, I would recommend using screws unless you're really comfortable with nails and know what you're doing, because it's pretty thin wood. But you could use 2x4s, you could use 1x, you can use scrap wood that you might have laying around. If it's a nice small one, you can make it out of pallet wood. But the one catch with building these is that you're going to need a pretty big bit. You're going to need a 1/2-inch bit to make holes like this right here. Let me go show you what that 1/2 bit looks like.
Hey, as you're doing that, just to let me know there's about 5 minutes left before we're transitioning.
Okay, perfect. Perfect timing. Thank you. So in order to make these holes, you do need a big bit, unless you have some other way of making holes. And then it pretty much works the same way. You pop one side in, and then make sure they're in there. And that's it. And of course, we need one more here, but you get the idea. So now we have this little mobile frame, and if your garden's growing out here, you can just set it over your garden, and that's it. The one last option would be, if you really wanted to, and you don't have this big drill bit, is you could put one screw and one screw on the inside, just like if it was a raised bed. But the only thing is that it's not a lot of material. Maybe if you use a 2x4 vertically, so you have those 4 inches, then you can put 2 screws. You definitely want at least 2 screws, or else this works like a hinge, like a little pivot. Okay, so the last option real quick, and this is if you have a soil garden or just planting in the ground, and you don't want to build a little frame. There's another option, and that involves using rebar. So these are pieces of rebar, also super cheap, and you can find them already pre-cut. I would say you want to use about a 2 foot, maybe 16 inches will still work, but I would recommend 2 feet. So you want to drive them. Let's say our garden's going right here. I'm standing in our little garden. And you want to leave 6 inches, at least 6 inches. And measure. So you want a 3-foot garden. Your other hole is going to go right here. Oh, make sure that you check that there's no pipes or anything going underneath, because 16 inches into the ground, you could actually hit something. So look for your sprinkler lines, or there's a number you can call. Maybe somebody will tell us what that number is, and PG&E and utilities will come and make sure that you're not going to punch into anything. To do that, I'm going to go back to our little hoops. Again, 1/2 inch. This is 3/8 inch rebar. You don't want to get 1/2 inch rebar or it'll be too big. So then you build 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 10, or 20, as long as you want, and you do the same thing with the plastic and the clips, or the spring clamp. So those are some of the options, and of course, if you really don't want to screw into your raised bed, you can always do the rebar trick in here. It's just a little bit, you might want to get a longer piece of rebar, since the soil in grow beds tends to be softer, or raised beds. Okay, how are we doing on time?
We're got like a minute left until it would be good to transition over.
Oh, perfect. We got a minute for the demo, or a minute?
A minute
for
the
transitioning?
demo.
A minute for the demo. Okay, so one other real quick thing then is this is just one way of doing it, but keep in mind that to protect any crop, you don't have to make it like a perfect little structure, especially if you have a bigger plant or a small tree or anything. You don't, have to go and build this whole thing around it. Even just a small piece of plastic over your crop will help. So if you have some walls or a fence or any existing structure and you can tie that plastic to a couple of things, having something over, think about it as a blanket, will really, really help to protect your crop, because it's the frost coming down that does most of the damage. It's not just the air temperature around, it's when the frost comes down. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you.
Should we do a handoff?
As you guys are handing off, I think Camille will share her screen again so we can close out with a couple of gardening questions that people submitted beforehand.
Oh, right.
And then we'll kind of wrap up. We'll ask a short survey to kind of end us off, but we wanted to address these questions that people submitted beforehand.
Yes.
So I'll just wait a second for Jesus to get comfortable again.
Okay. So, yeah, are we ready to just go into these questions?
I think so, yeah. The first one was from Robin.
Right. Okay, Robin asked about the use of cover crops and preparing soil for the spring. Growing lettuce and spinach now, and what about using raked leaves for mulch? I think that's great.
Just doing it all at once.
What's that?
Just doing it all at once. The best approach to do it all at once.
Oh, the best approach to do it all at once. Well, I think you got it more or less laid out. The one thing I will say is that it's a little bit late for plant. I don't know if Robin, if you've already planted the cover crops and you're ready to work them back into the soil, or if you're talking about planting cover crops now. Because usually for cover crops for the winter, you want to start them off like late summer, early fall, or even into early winter. But at this point, it might be a little bit late to grow cover crops and wait for them to mature and become, worthwhile enough to work it back into the soil. So I would say if you have a supply of leaves, I would recommend that instead of cover crops to try to amend your garden. So leaves you can definitely work into, well, maybe I should wait and see if Robin, if you want to kind of like tell us a little bit more about whether it's you already have a crop that's ready to be, that's full grown and ready to be worked back in, or if you're talking about planting now.
Robin said that they just barely started, so maybe it's too late, maybe 3 weeks ago.
Oh, but there's already cover crops planted.
I believe that's what they're saying.
Okay, well, that's great. So then I would say just let the cover crops grow. You can use the mulch or the leaf mulch. You can definitely incorporate that into the ground around your cover crops if you can access it. And this goes for anybody really. If you have a lot of like fallen leaves in your yard or your area, you can definitely use those as mulch. You know, if you have any way of breaking them down or shredding them, that helps. It helps them to break down faster, but just any kind of mulch, whether it's fancy wooden stuff that you buy or just leaves, it'll help to retain moisture in the soil. It'll help to protect the soil from drying out too quickly. And then when they actually do start to rot, it'll bring in all sorts of good stuff like earthworms and all these decomposers that are going to help your garden and your soil most importantly. But I would say if you already have a cover crop going, then go ahead and use whatever leaves you have as mulch around it. And if you're talking about growing lettuce and spinach now, you can, and you don't want to go out and buy soil or fertilizer or compost, or you don't have any compost ready, you can also just, again, it works better if the leaves are a little bit broken down, and there's tons of ways of doing that. You don't have to sit there by hand either, but you can work that into your soil. So even just leaf mulch is some good carbon, and it'll break down, and it'll definitely help your soil for planting whenever you are ready to start planting the lettuce and the spinach. And cover crops, I'm super glad that you're doing that. There's tons of benefits to using cover crops, protecting your soil from erosion and helps to keep weeds down. Plus it's a green manure. It's a natural way to fertilize and feed your soil. I hope that helps, Robin. As far as doing it all at the same time, it sounds like you're on the path to pretty much doing exactly that, and it's just a matter of how soon you want to do it. But now is a good time to do all those things.
Mm-hmm. Should we move to the next?
Sure. Okay, so Yo asked about, sorry, I can barely read out here.
I can read it for you if you'd like.
Oh, that would be great.
Okay, so Yo has a veggie garden with 3 raised beds, and they usually just plant summer crops and then remove those at the season's end. But then by spring planting, stinging nettles have always taken over. They remove those stinging nettles annually and are really careful to remove the roots, but they always come back every year. So any suggestions about preventing that?
Yes, I know those nettles are so resilient, but it sounds like you spend some time trying to look it up and learn about it. But yes, be as diligent as you can with removing down to the last little tidbits and pieces of the root, because it doesn't take much. It'll grow back from even like little shreds of root and come back and mature into this fully formed plant. So start off with that, which it sounds like you're already doing. As far as other options, we were just talking about cover crops. Cover crops also help to prevent weeds. So, when you mentioned something about your beds going dormant, if you know your beds are going to go dormant for the winter or end of fall or whenever, I would recommend planting some cover crops then. And what they'll do is, if you plant them at the right time and before the nettle kicks up and starts its whole thing again, they'll block out a lot of the sun and hopefully take up more nutrients and prevent the nettle from having such a comfortable environment with no competition. So think about cover crops maybe for next year. And then the one other thing is, I believe stinging nettle prefer, like most things, prefer a bit more of a acidic soil. So you can always, especially if you know your crops or your grow beds are going dormant or unused for any time, you can use that time and sort of try liming your soil. And I know lime is, it's acidic, but it's actually limestone. So try increasing the pH of your soil with either calcium or wood ash or oyster or whatever. There's tons of different ways to do it. Even eggshells as well. Although with everything you use and incorporating into the soil like that, if it's inorganic, then the finer the material, the powder. So I say this because like eggshells, a lot of us already use eggshells, and it's a very long-term thing. You just slowly let it break down. If you want a more immediate impact to your soil, you want to like almost pulverize the eggshell. So those are just a couple of suggestions that I think, definitely worth trying. I think the cover crop would be a great place to start. But yeah, good luck, and let us know if any of that helped, or if you found some other option or solution.
Right. I think we just have one more slide where we're plugging our Google group.
Oh, right. Yes. So for any of you who are here for the first time, we do have a Google group that we're trying to really get everybody to check out and participate in, because essentially it's like an extension of, we want it to be an extension of this chat box here, during the Zoom. So there will be a link. Has the link already been sent, or an invitation for everybody, or is that coming up?
I sent it to everyone who had registered as of midweek last week, but I'll try to find it to resend now, and also in the follow-up email.
That would be great. I definitely think if anybody had any burning questions or just comments, again, we're all learning here. Any advice that you didn't get a chance to share or have read out by just, definitely check out the Google group link and join the group, because it's what we're really hoping to do, is to have this conversation, kind of have this be a place for us to all continue to share in between these workshops or these Zoom groups. When there is activity there, I check it at least once a week or a couple times a week, but it's there for everybody to question and for everybody to share. And pictures make a big difference when it comes to posting on there. So, the whole pictures speak 1,000 words thing is definitely true. So yeah, the Google group, check it out. And Jess is going to send the link shortly. Thank you,
Yeah,
Jess.
I just sent it out in the chat, and then we'll also send it up in the follow-up email. So you'll have that as well. I think the last bit is just a satisfaction survey, which is super, super important and helpful for us to know how this went for you. We're always trying to kind of shift things to make this more helpful, and so we really appreciate your feedback. So I just launched it, and as people are doing that, if you have any closing words, Jesus, feel free to share.
No, I just really appreciate everybody being here. These are very challenging times, and they seem to just keep going on and on. But there's also a light now, feels like, at the end of this tunnel. And I think we're doing these workshops to keep everybody engaged and everybody motivated, because there's obviously a lot of interest. But I am definitely looking forward to a day when we can do these in person. I was going to say again, but we've never actually done one of these edible home gardening in person. This has been a COVID baby. And so looking forward to that, looking forward to maybe visiting different community gardens as part of this same group, looking forward to all sorts of cool in-person workshops so we don't have to have, you know, this whole camera thing to deal with. But I appreciate every one of you being here today, and I look forward to one day maybe meeting you and talking in person. So thanks, stay safe, and happy gardening.